Stories behind the ag brands we love and the ag brands we love to hate. What color is your tractor? With Chrissy Wozniak.
Hi, I'm Chrissy Wozniak, and welcome to What Color is Your Tractor? The company that we're going to talk to today is the reason that we have tractor color wars. They started in the 1830s, and they put Moline, Illinois on the map. We're about to hear the story of none other than John Deere. I'd like to welcome Neil Dahlstrom, Branded Properties and Heritage Manager of John Deere. Thank you so much for joining me today, Neil.
Thanks for having me.
So can you tell me about the early years of John Deere?
Yeah, the early years. John Deere was a blacksmith. He moved to Illinois from Vermont, probably in the winter of 1836, the edge of the frontier at that period in time. And he was looking for a fresh start, like so many people at that period in time. He opened a blacksmith shop, and in 1837, he built that first steel plow. And that plow really came about. It was a combination of experience working as a blacksmith and opportunity. He heard farmers grumbling about thick prairie soil, trying to break the prairie. And he was at a local sawmill. There was only one. And spotted a broken sawmill blade. So what he would have found would have been what was called a pit saw, or a big up and down saw.
Okay.
And it was made out of steel. And he took it back to the shop and built that first plow. And I think often people think, well, okay, you built the first plow and then fast forward and you're rich and famous and you're John Deere. Reality is it took time. It took going bankrupt 5 or 6 times. It took partners.
Wow.
It took a lot of business acumen to actually turn that into a business over the first decade.
Wow. Yeah. So why did the plant end up in Moline?
John Deere was looking for wider opportunities. He actually surveyed several other towns. He was negotiating. He was looking for land. He needed timber. He needed coal. He needed a lot of raw materials, and he needed transportation. You need a way to bring raw materials in and a way to ship finished goods. So he started shopping around. He ended up in Moline, which was a town with a few hundred people in it at that period in time. But he was looking west. And if we look at the way that he negotiated the settlement with his partner in Grand Detour, his partner took all the territory east of the old business, which was existing territory. John Deere took everything west. And in 1848, there wasn't a whole lot that was west. Gold was found in California early that year. But the local town boosters in Moline gave him free water power rights. They gave him land to build a factory on.
Wow.
And they told him the railroad was coming to town in the next couple of years. And in 1856, the first railroad bridge across the Mississippi River was going to be built just a couple miles downriver. So Moline wasn't an accident. He picked it very deliberately and grew from there.
Oh, that's cool. And he had a few business partners along the way. So what are the stories of those partners?
Lots of business partners. In Grand Detour, he entered a partnership with Leonard Andrus, who owned the sawmill. And Andrus brought capital, he brought money, and John Deere brought expertise, tools, equipment. They about every year they brought a new partner in who would infuse a little capital, and then they would leave when they found out there was no money in the plow business, and it was incredibly difficult. So that happened quite a bit. When Deere moved to Moline, he joined forces with John Gould, who was the accountant, and Robert Tate, who was a mechanic in their shop. And the three of them came to Moline together, operated under the firm Deere, Tate, and Gould from 1848 to 1852. Mm-hmm. John Deere was a sole proprietor for the first time since the early 1830s.
Wow. And
soon his son joined the business, Charles. Sons-in-law joined the business, and it became very much a family affair in the early years.
I see, yeah. And then what about during the war years? I heard, John Deere supported the war effort too, right?
Yeah, during the war years. And really, it doesn't matter if you're talking about the Civil War, World War I, World War II. John Deere played a role in that. In World War I, from the United States entered World War I in 1917, but for several years, Deere had designed and manufactured everything from ammunition carts and ammunition wagons for the French Army, later the American Army, things like utility carts or carts that you could use to haul ammunition. Wow. So they were pretty active there. World War II, all the factories converted to wartime production, everything from mobile laundry units to tank transmissions to airplane components. Half of the John Deere harvester workforce was women during the war. So we've got a lot of our own Rosie the Riveter stories here at John Deere. And then the John Deere Battalion, which was an ordnance battalion made up of John Deere employees and dealers, just under 1,000 of them who served overseas repairing tanks and artillery. So really a lot of different contributions depending on what period of history we're talking.
Wow. Yeah. And I from what I understand, John Deere himself never saw a gasoline tractor, right?
That's right. John Deere never saw a gasoline tractor. He saw some of the kind of early versions of the gasoline tractor. So the first successful gasoline tractor is credited to John Freilich in 1892. And of course, his company went on to become the Waterloo Gasoline Engine Company, which Deere acquired in 1918. John Deere himself died in 1886, so it was a little before his time. But he actually experimented with what was called a steam traction engine in the 1850s. He partnered with an early designer named Joseph Fox, who designed a steam traction engine and took it to the Illinois State Fair in 1858. And John Deere custom built a 12 or 14 bottom plow to actually go with the steam traction engine.
Oh, that's it.
Yeah. So John Deere returned to Moline and told the local newspaper, I'm going to build one if it's the last thing I do. And unfortunately, he apparently abandoned the work because we never heard about it again.
Right.
But he told the paper it's going to be an amazing day when we can look across the prairies and these mobile units can pull a 12 or 14 bottom plow. So he was very forward looking in that way.
That's cool. And the Deere family stayed involved for a long time too, right?
Yeah, that's right. There were a number of Deeres involved in the business, especially in the 19th century. Charles Deere was our second CEO. His son-in-law, William Butterworth, was the third CEO. His grandson, Charles Deere Wyman, was the fourth CEO.
That's amazing.
And actually, until William Hewitt retired in 1982, there was a Deere family member who was the CEO of the company.
Wow, that's quite the legacy, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what was the first product that John Deere manufactured?
Well, the first product was the steel plow. And Deere went from building one plow to 2 plows to 10 plows. So he was very much a plow manufacturer in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, and then started to branch out into things like drag harrows and cultivators. During the Civil War in the 1860s, Deere introduced a riding cultivator for the first time, which was one of the earliest products to actually take farmers off their feet.
Wow.
Then as you get through the later part of the 19th century, you start seeing products like corn planters, wagons, those sorts of agricultural implements and kind of support vehicles for the most part.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's neat. And then what about a timeline of products? How did it go from there?
Well, of course, it's hard to cover 184 years succinctly. Mm-hmm. But you kind of have these eras. The 19th and early 20th centuries are very much, walking plows and horse pulled implements. You start to get into what they called power farming or mechanization in the early 20th century, starting with, of course, gasoline and kerosene powered tractors. You start to see things like corn binders and grain binders. John Deere built the John Deere Harvester Works and entered the harvesting business in 1912. And then in the 1920s, you see the advent of the combine, and then later the self-propelled combine. Mm-hmm. So you see these machine forms just kind of evolve over time. And I think it's just really fascinating that it's easy to think, okay, well, the tractor came along and now everyone's farming with tractors.
Right.
Well, it took another 30 to 40 years before tractors outnumbered horses on American farms. It was a very long and gradual sort of process. And so you go from horse drawn to tractor drawn, and now you get into self-propelled machines in the 40s and 50s, and then you start to see these kind of big jumps in productivity on farms.
Right. Yeah. So do you know the number, like how many products are manufactured today?
I don't know how many products are manufactured today. And actually, there's probably not really any period in time where I could say this was the number of products that were manufactured.
Right. Yeah.
Especially when you start looking at all the different divisions, you start looking at construction equipment and forestry equipment and lawn and garden equipment and road building equipment. There's quite a bit out there, and of course, when you start talking to people who are incredibly knowledgeable, you have discussions about things like, well, how do you actually define a tractor? What's the difference between an industrial and an ag tractor? Are they different products? Are they the same products? Yeah. Definitely today, when you're talking 1930s and 40s and 50s, the line's blurred. So I'm an archivist, and I always put an asterisk on everything to say, here's what it is based on these definitions that we've agreed to in advance, and we have a different opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. Deere also made bicycles and snowmobiles at one time too, right?
Yeah, that's right. We've actually made bicycles twice in our history. First in the 1890s, and of course these were bicycles that had wooden rims, but they very much look like a 10-speed of today. And then again, we went into the bicycle business in the 1970s, and in both cases, it was to kind of capitalize on these huge consumer trends that were happening, and people were becoming more mobile, and John Deere entered those businesses.
Yeah. And the John Deere snowmobile, that just seems so different. So out of the box for John Deere, right?
Yeah, very much. It made sense in the 1970s. We had formed our consumer products division. And so it ranged everything from snowmobiles to bicycles to you could buy John Deere branded grills and grilling tools.
Wow.
So it was a pretty broad line, and the snowmobiles were incredibly popular. We had some world-class snowmobile racing teams. And I think the most enduring legacy of the snowmobile line was the tagline, "Nothing runs like a deer," which was actually created for the snowmobile line.
Was it really?
Yeah.
Huh. I didn't know that. That's pretty cool. Yeah. And that brings me to thinking about the logo. We've all seen so many versions of the Deere logo. So how and why has that logo evolved over the years?
There's, of course, a lot of different versions, but there's only been 8 official versions.
Okay.
Meaning 8 official trademark versions of the leaping deer that we know. So the first one was trademarked in 1876. It appeared at least as early as 1874. We've seen it in newspapers in 1874, and John Deere himself actually had a hand in that one. John Deere got together with a friend of his who was a county surveyor, and they were talking about ways to differentiate John Deere products, and they came up with this idea of a deer leaping over a log. And the story from Melvin Gould, the county surveyor, was that they cut a stencil out of a sheet of brass, and that was what they used to create that first one.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah, so it's it was a way to differentiate their products. In the 1860s, there were more than 2,000 manufacturers of plows in the United States alone. Wow. So it was a crowded space. This is a period in time where a lot of companies named themselves after the town that they operated in, and Deere had several competitors in Moline, so you couldn't any longer say, well, this is the Moline plow, because there were other Moline plows. And that was kind of the initial driver for that. And the trademark has evolved over the years. Oftentimes it was driven because of the ways that the leaping deer had to be applied to products, either through stenciling or decals, maybe the way that the materials that were used on products. So maybe you wanted to create a leaping deer that said quality farm equipment on it because you wanted to say something. Well, then that is no longer makes as much sense when you're also making construction equipment. Everything can't say quality farm equipment on it. So you see some of those evolutions. And then bringing us to the current trademark that came out in 2000, which I think was really the most kind of radical change. It's the first time that the deer was actually leaping up instead of down. And that was very deliberate because Deere is a company in the ascendancy on the way up. And you want that represented in your trademark.
That's really cool.
Yeah. And of course, just stylistically, it was the advent of the internet. It was a digital era. So you want cleaner lines. You want something that you can use on products, but you can also use electronically. So there were a lot of factors that went into that design.
That makes sense. So you have a rich history of serving the industry, but how does modern John Deere want to be seen in the ag industry today?
I think John Deere very much wants to be seen the way that John Deere wanted us to be seen in 1837, which was very much an innovative company. Today we'll use terms like tech leader to talk about technology in our machines. We'll talk about having connected machines. But John Deere would have used similar terms. He would have talked about the technology of steel, which no one was using in plows, which he had to order from England in the 1830s or 1840s to even, that's pretty big expense and a pretty big risk for someone to believe in a product so much that you would go to those lengths and really risk anything to make that happen. But I think you have a combination of smart equipment, you have a combination of connected equipment, sustainable equipment, all things that have been driving the company, I think, since day one, is very much what still drives the company today.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's pretty clear too, I think, to everyone. So who are some of the memorable people in the company along the way?
Well, I have a list of about 40,000 of them. I won't go through all of them. But yeah, I definitely have my favorites. And it's interesting. And I think one of the things that has really benefited John Deere over these years, you think about it, John May is our 10th CEO in almost 200 years. And so we've been incredibly fortunate that we seem to have the right CEO for the right time. Mm-hmm. And that's important because I often get asked, well, who was the best CEO? I say, well, you can't really make that comparison because John Deere maybe wouldn't have been a great CEO today. But at the time, he was perfect because he knew how to get things done. He understood the landscape. He understood his product. He created all these principles that we continue to operate under today, like innovation and quality and commitment to customers and employees. But I can say I certainly have some favorites. One is a guy named Dr. Warren E. Taylor, who ran John Deere's soil culture department starting in 1912. He was hired. He started several John Deere experimental farms. So even before we got into the tractor business in 1918, we spent 7 years doing research and development. And he was testing all of these machines, motorized cultivators, a single-cylinder tractor, a 4-cylinder tractor, a 2-cylinder tractor on our experimental farms. But he was also mailing information to customers and asking them to send back soil samples in 1912, and then started writing books, a book called Soil Culture and Farm Methods, where he broke down from we use the word agronomy today. He would have used different words. He would have talked about kind of scientific methods. But just a really interesting person. He was a homeopathic doctor before he joined Deere. He ran a large state experimental farm nearby, and John Deere went and hired him and said, build experimental farms for us so we can test everything.
Wow. So the whole renewable soil regeneration, that's not a new idea then, right?
It's not a new idea. He's talking about crop rotation In the 20s, he's talking about the corn borer and how to combat the corn borer, because there aren't permanent solutions. So you've always got to kind of deal with it as it comes. And he was something who really led the charge. Anyone who has copies of the Furrow magazine from the early 20th century, you're going to read a regular feature from Dr. Taylor, where he's sharing all of this information. He was giving upwards of between 50 and 80 speeches a year, plus writing, plus doing his day job. So he was quite prolific. So he's kind of grown to be one of my just one of those people that really stand out over the years.
Yeah, that's remarkable, and obviously so much passion.
Yeah, absolutely, a lot of passion, and just really kind of believing in everything that he did. And again, it's how do you improve this? How do you make it better? That was always the goal, and then how do you build on that? So that's one out of my 40,000.
Right. Yeah. Who's another one? Tell me about another one.
Another one was Charles Deere Wyman, who was John Deere's great-grandson, the fourth CEO of the company. Charles Deere Wyman was a World War I veteran. His dream in life was to fly airplanes. He actually got his pilot's license training on a Wright Flyer.
No way.
So he was a very early aviation pioneer. His name is actually on a plaque on Governor's Island in New York as an early aviation pioneer. But of course, his birthright was farm equipment. Mm-hmm. And after serving in World War I, becoming injured, he came to Moline. He re-enlisted, spent some time in France, came back and really started to lead a lot of the research and development work at Deere in the 20s and 1930s. He was CEO until 1955 when he passed away. But in 1953, he did something fairly important, which was kick off the program that became the new generation of power in 1960. The 10 series, the 3010, the 4010, the 5010, which all debuted at Deere Day in Dallas. But in 1953, he got a small group of engineers together in Waterloo, Iowa, and told them, we're going to redesign the entire product line. And the only thing we might carry forward is the green and yellow paint.
Wow.
This is a company that had been building two-cylinder tractors since 1918, had been incredibly successful at it. But he recognized that times were changing, that farmers were looking for greater horsepower. And that set off a 7-year project. And there's a lot of famous stories in that period. They rented a former grocery store, the meat market it was called, put paper on the windows so no one could see in, and set about designing tractors and expanding from there. But it's pretty visionary to say, we're John Deere, and the only thing we're going to carry forward is green and yellow paint. When they were done, about 95% of the product line was completely redesigned from scratch.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Wow. So for almost 2 centuries, producers have been choosing John Deere. So why that loyalty?
I think there's a lot of reasons for the loyalty. It's, again, I think all things start with John Deere, and I think about a customer in the 1870s. Unfortunately, it was in a lawsuit, but it was a trademark lawsuit, which kind of led to the creation of that Leaping Deer trademark. But about 33 witnesses were deposed, and a lot of these were customers. And one of them, who was a hardware dealer in Missouri, said, I only buy John Deere. So when this other company came and tried to sell me plows that they said were as good as John Deere's, I said no. And the reason being was John Deere has consistent product quality. And if I ever had an issue, I went back to John Deere. John Deere would visit me. We would work it out. He would take it back to the shop. He would develop something that was even better, and he'd bring it back to me. And so you kind of build these relationships over time. And so I think you can look at stories like that. You can look at stories like John Deere during the Great Depression. when farmers were really struggling, and John Deere made a decision to stop collecting payments from customers and decided that instead of recalling equipment or forcing payment, they said we're just going to sit tight, and when things get better, then we'll get back to it. And that's what happened. And I know when I started working at Deere in 2001, I was still hearing stories from people who talked about how John Deere carried their grandparents through the Depression. And that builds a different type of loyalty. And I think, you can pick different decades and pick different versions of those stories, whether it's donations through the United Way for local schools, or it's service projects in India, or it's an equipment donation at the state fair. You have all of those things wrapped into this kind of foundation of incredibly awesome machines and technology, and it always goes back to that.
And people, I guess. Yeah. From what you're saying, it sounds like there's always been passionate, incredible people along the way.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, that's what it boils down to. You have relationships, you talk, you listen, you take those things back, you work it out, because you're buying equipment because it makes you more productive, it makes you more profitable, and you can't lose sight of that, and that's hasn't changed from the 1840s to the 1920s to today.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so, what are a few things that you think that people don't know about John Deere?
Few things people don't know about John Deere. Boy, that's a tough question. A lot is, of course, there's so many things that go on behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. There's so many products that maybe don't come to market, but the technology does come to market, but you don't see it. You think about today, we talk about autonomous tractors, and you think about development. John Deere was looking at tractor electrification in the 1920s. And it just didn't quite develop. And some of those things take time. I think about products like a gator that we developed in the early 2000s that runs on hydrogen.
Really? So, I've never heard about that.
Yeah, so there's a lot of these kind of product stories that are incredibly innovative. But I like to talk about the 8000 series tractor that came out in the early 1990s. And it's similar to the Charles Deere Wyman story with the green and yellow paint. It was the brainchild of an engineer who drew a sketch on the back of an airline ticket on an airplane, and just had this radical idea. And you have this idea, then you take it to someone, and someone actually listens to you. And then you start this kind of skunkworks project and develop something incredibly revolutionary. I think about the formation of what was called the Precision Farming Group around the same time in the early 1990s. And talking to people who were there, who said, well, we were given a blank sheet of paper and asked to figure out what was next. And we spent a lot of time talking about what was next, and we landed on this radical idea of using satellites in agriculture. And we didn't think anybody was going to listen to us. And who listened to us was the CEO. And he said, go figure it out.
Oh, that's so cool. And now look at us.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's things that you start to take for granted that they were always there. But you forget that it took some pretty bold ideas and bold initiative to actually even present it, but to get buy-in and commitment and then to development and then to bring it to market. So you see this kind of just this visionary perspective happen time and time again. Mm-hmm. And in my line of business, we call them key traits, which is, well, the decisions are different. Maybe the products are different. The technology is different, but you look for these key traits or attributes, and you can find them in 1850 and you can find them in 1877 when we decided to go into the corn planter business in Moline, or when we decided in 1910 to enter the harvesting business, or 1918 to go into the tractor business. So you see these kind of characteristics that come out time and time again of figuring out how to do the right thing, trying to figure out the right way to listen to people, and to build profitable products.
That's cool. And so how long have you been with John Deere?
I've been with Deere 20 years.
Wow.
And I've spent most of that time working in one form or another in corporate archives, research, in working with like the John Deere Historic Site, our 1840s historic site and blacksmith shop, the Tractor and Engine Museum in Waterloo, or the John Deere Pavilion. So trying to bring these stories to life, and everyone gets to be jealous because I actually get to do the research too. I get to go through the old stuff.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Yeah. And so my last question is, and I know the answer to this one already, but what color is your tractor?
Of course, my tractor's green.
Yeah. Yeah. And have you always been a Deere person?
Yeah, I've always been a Deere person. I remember when I was in about 5th grade, I had I pitched my parents an idea, which they did not take me up on, that if they bought me a John Deere lawn and garden tractor, that I could mow lawns on my way to and from school every day. Because in my mind, I could just do a single pass all the way to school, then I could do another pass all the way home. They didn't take me up on it, but that's kind of my earliest recollection of wanting to drive a green and yellow tractor of any size.
That's awesome. Very good. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. That was some great history, and I got to learn some things too.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much for listening to What Color is Your Tractor? I hope you learned something new about the brand you love or hate. If you're a manufacturer who would like to apply to be featured on this show, please visit whatcolorisyourtractor.com/contact and fill out the form.